This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome yet again to another episode of Geographics. I'm your host Karl Smallwood, and today we're talking about Alcatraz, America's most infamous prison. And as with all the videos here on Geographics, this one is based on original scripts submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That one being Ben Edelman, whose name I've been mispronouncing in every video prior to this, for which I apologise. But you know what? Let's get to it. If you lived in America during the 1930s, 40s or 50s, there is one place above all others you never wanted to go. Its very name, Alcatraz, sparked terror within the hearts of even the most hardened criminals, and with good reason. It was considered the worst prison in the country, perhaps the world itself, while it was open. For almost 30 years, the United States kept its worst offenders locked up at Alcatraz, where Mother Nature, as well as steel and thousands of tons of concrete, kept prisoners from escaping. It was designed to hold the worst of the worst, incorrigibles or too dangerous or too evil to be kept anywhere else. Rehabilitation of criminals was not on the agenda, only punishment, since Alcatraz was held up by the other prisons as a terrible warning: behave or else you'll end up there. The unfortunate result was an environment seemingly custom built to just drive men mad, which many prisoners did, having to leave the prison bound up in straitjackets. Today though, Alcatraz is one of San Francisco's most popular tourist attractions, the old building the province of curious schoolchildren and historians trying to keep them from crumbling. Fortunately for today's visitors, escaping from Alcatraz is a lot easier than it used to be. Located in the San Francisco Bay, not far from the entrance to the Golden Gate, Alcatraz Island was neither very large nor very impressive to early visitors to the area. It got its name Alcatraz from the archaic Spanish word for, I'll give you a chance to guess, pelican. Wondering why pelican? Well, the island used to be home to lots of pelicans prior to the prison being established there. Its other nickname, The Rock, is kind of a hint to what people thought of it back then. An unassuming hunk of rock sat out there in the bay, not doing very much at all. In the 1850s, as people flooded to San Francisco following the California gold rush, the new American authorities decided that Alcatraz would be the ideal place to build a military fort in order to protect the entrance to the bay. The fort's guns were never actually fired in anger, but the army soon found a new use for the site as a prison, a vocation it would have for the next century. All kinds of prisons were kept at Fort Alcatraz in the 1800s, Confederate sympathizers and POWs, pirates, Indian leaders who resisted the US government, and soldiers who just ran afoul of military law. In the aftermath of the 1906 earthquake and fire, which leveled almost the entire city, prisoners that had been kept in the city's jails were transferred to Alcatraz for safekeeping, for lack of a better term. In 1909, it was decided to demolish what was left of the old citadel and build a new military prison in its place, the bulk of which still survives to this day. The prison was officially a disciplinary barracks designed to punish soldiers convicted of various crimes, with the goal of eventually having them return to their units once they'd learned their lesson. During World War I, many of the prisoners held at Alcatraz were simply conscientious objectors who refused to be drafted into military service or hold a weapon. By the onset of the Great Depression, the US Army was comparatively smaller, with a budget to boot. They were more than happy to offload Alcatraz to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, who had big plans to turn it into the most infamous civilian prison in the country. In the early 1930s, many Americans were terrified by the seemingly unstoppable crime wave that swept the country in the early years of the Depression. Between the organised gangs of bootleggers in the big cities and the marauding bands of bank robbers who prowled the roadways, there seemed to be no decent people left in the country, at least according to the nation's newspapers, who just loved reporting on that sort of thing. Many of these criminals, once caught in prison, continued to cause problems from inside the federal prison system. The newly formed Bureau of Prisons sought a solution, and they found it in the form of military prison on Alcatraz Island. Federal officials came up with the idea of a prison that would house the absolute worst of the worst, the so-called incorrigibles. These were men who were prone to violence, continued to run criminal rackets from inside their cells, or simply had a history of escape attempts or extreme violence against guards and other inmates. After acquiring Alcatraz from the Army in 1933, the BOP set about making several improvements to the facility to make it, and I quote, escape-proof. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary officially opened for business in August 1934 when a trainload of prisoners from Leavenworth, Kansas arrived and took up their residence in the cell blocks. From the start, Alcatraz was operated very differently from other federal prisons. For example, all prisoners were kept in solitary cells to prevent violence between inmates, and also, them porking one another. And as if that wasn't bad enough, all prisoners were also forbidden from speaking to one another unless absolutely necessary. What could possibly go wrong? On the plus side, food at Alcatraz was notably better than it was at other prisons, and prisoners were allowed to eat as much food as they wanted to come din-din times, the one caveat being that they had to finish their plate, because wasting food like chit-chat was against the rules. Prisoners who broke the rules were punished with solitary confinement in D Block, where the cells had no furniture, forcing them to sleep on the concrete floor. The worst cells, though, were inarguably the ones that were kept in complete darkness, where prisoners were chained to the walls, like a relic of a medieval dungeon. Horror stories of the practices of Alcatraz dungeons persisted long after the facility was modernised to do away with all these old cells and, the barbaric practices that resulted from having them. Don't chain people to walls. Come on. Still, while the conditions in Alcatraz were certainly poor, and poor enough that prisoners took to calling it Alcatraz, it didn't really live up to the reputation that it inspired, especially the comparisons it got to the infamous Devil's Island in French Guiana. Conditions in the prison were mostly better than other prisons in the federal prison system, which suffered from overcrowding and poorly trained staff. As you can imagine, mostly what got to prisoners was the relentless tedium of prison life in Alcatraz. Most every day passed exactly the same, and you could tell what day of the week it was based on what was being served for dinner in the cafeteria. This was entirely by design, and the prison was supposed to be a punishment for prisoners who would routinely violate the rules over at other federal prisons. Officially, nobody was ever sent to Alcatraz directly after sentencing, and conversely, nobody was ever directly released from there either. Instead, prisoners would be sent there from other prisons after their sentencing if they were deemed to be a particular threat, or in some cases just annoying, as we'll touch on in a moment, and sent to Alcatraz to do a period of hard time to teach them a lesson, and after a while they'd be sent back to their previous prison and allowed to go free. Likewise, when prisoners were reaching the end of their sentence, they'd be sent back to their other prison and released from there instead of Alcatraz, because they didn't want to deal with it. Because it was an island and they had island things to deal with, I suppose. In regards to the rights for prisoners, the only ones that were guaranteed in Alcatraz were food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Anything else was deemed to be a privilege that had to be earned via good behaviour. Even working in the model industries building was considered to be a privilege. So was sending and receiving mail, as well as receiving visitors. Both were subject to strict control. All mail, for example, was read by guards, and any references to criminal activity or sex was censored out, and the entire letter was transcribed by typewriter with the carbon copy given to the prisoner, apparently a precaution against incoming letters being laced with dope. As for visitors, they had to be first screened by the FBI, as no criminal associates were allowed to visit an inmate at Alcatraz. Unfortunately, the strict regime, unairing day after day, tended to play havoc on the mental health of the prisoners. Who'd have guessed it? Many of whom weren't the most stable people to begin with. Again, who'd have guessed that? The conditions drove many prisoners mad to the point where they committed quite heinous and irrational acts. One well-known example was a prisoner who systematically chopped off all the fingers on one of his hand with a hatchet, and then, once they were done, handed the hatchet to their cellmate and asked them to continue doing so on their other hand. Another inmate chewed through all the arteries in their wrists in a suicide attempt, which was also popular at the prison. Other acts of wanton violence included the severing of one's own Achilles tendon with broken eyeglasses or razor blades as a form of protest against the conditions in the prison. It's been well established that prolonged periods of social isolation will trigger some level of insanity in people. And, let us know in the comments, what weird habit, hobby, or idiosyncrasy you picked up during the pandemic to pass the time. Personally, I got really good at throwing tea bags into mugs from across the room, to the point where me and a friend of mine were competing on TikTok to see who could get their tea bag into their mug in the most ridiculous, convoluted way. I'm not proud of it. Actually, no, I am. Some of those shots are pretty good. Let us know what you got up to. Anyway, moving on. Moving back to Alcatraz, as you might imagine, the prisoners who suffered most from this were the ones who, for one reason or another, were sentenced to a long time in solitary confinement. Now, formally, there was a rule against putting a prisoner into solitary confinement for any more than 19 days. However, the guards and the wardens frequently found ways around this. For example, they would put a prisoner into solitary confinement for 19 days, let them out for a day, and then put them straight back in for another 19 for the same offence. And quite understandably, another aggregating factor was the rule of silence, which was eventually discontinued in the late 1930s after it was determined to be causing more problems than it solved. No, I don't think they noticed. It was dark and it was cold, so I think you got away with that. Oh! Hello! This part of the video is sponsored by Squarespace.
His leg came off!
Oh no! So while I fix the Fact Fiend skeleton, so fans of my content on Fact Fiend will know. Oh no, it broke! No! No! Okay, so let's say, guys, I want to make a memorial page for the Fact Fiend skeleton. What would I do? Like, where would I start trying to create a memorial page for Bonely?
I would turn maybe to Squarespace, the sponsor of the video.
Could Squarespace help us?
They could, Karl. Squarespace allows you to customize a website that could be specifically for mourning the skeleton.
One of the things that Squarespace lets you do while creating a website is you can drag and drop individual parts. So you could have like a picture of bone and you could go boop and put it right there. And the problem is, in real life, we don't have the fluid engine. We can't drag and drop pieces back onto Bonely. We don't have the fluid engine.
Squarespace, get on it. A real life equivalent for skeletons.
I'm really upset. I've had this thing for 3 years. One of the things that Squarespace lets you do is monetize your time, because you may not be long for this world. Is that too threatening? It sounds like a threat. But you can sell your time by charging subscriptions or one-off fees to access certain parts of your website that you create.
You could also sell your wares, so you could sell his leg.
I could buy a replacement. Yeah, we could buy replacement legs or anything like that. So the thing is, people just watching this who don't know the backstory to this skeleton, like, why is there a plastic skeleton? Why that outfit? Why? And so the answer is Squarespace. They made it all happen.
Oh, the law.
The law creation.
What if you want to keep track of how many people are memorializing?
Well, Squarespace allows you to create mailing lists and track your analytics so you can see where in the world people came to visit your website from and adjust your content accordingly. Because online, analytics are king.
Playing with the leg.
I'm going to have to answer. I'm really sorry. If any of that sounds interesting to you folks at home and you would like to register your own domain or get yourself a website, you can do so by following the links www.squarespace.com/geographics and using the code Geographics to get 10% off your first order of a website or a domain. Cheers, Squarespace. The unpleasant environment of Alcatraz, which, like most of the San Francisco Bay Area, was cold and fog-bound for most of the year, as well as the harsh conditions of Alcatraz prison itself, led many to contemplate escape, but that was easier said than done. When it opened in 1934, as we mentioned, Alcatraz was considered to be the most secure prison in America, christened with the label escape-proof. Alcatraz's first warden, James Johnson, who also helped design the prison when it was first modernised in 1933, was an old hand, having served as both the warden of Folsom and San Quentin state prisons in California for over a decade. He had the pick of the federal system's employees and the budget to employ pretty much all of them. The guard-to-prisoner ratio was the lowest in the system over at Alcatraz. Beyond the cells, guard towers and barbed wire fences, the other major factor keeping prisoners from escaping Alcatraz was the location. The island was about 1.25 miles from the mainland, surrounded by water that was both cold and subject to harsh currents, and according to legend, full of sharks. The theory was that anyone who managed to successfully make it out of the prison would never be able to make it to shore. They'd drown before they made it. All these factors aside, it didn't stop the inmates from trying to escape. Anyway, there were a reported 14 different escape attempts in the 30 years the prison was in operation, ranging from violent to genius in their execution. Arguably the most famous attempt came in 1962, when Frank Morris masterminded a complex plan that took months to set up. Using tools made from spoons and nail clippers, Morris and two other men successfully tunneled their way out of their cells and made their way out onto the roof of their cell block before shimmying down a drain pipe and paddling away from the island using a raft made of stolen raincoats. To fool the guards, they left behind dummy heads made of papier-mâché in their beds. The three were never seen again and officially are listed as missing, presumed drowned, though speculation about them surviving and going on the run persist to this day. In contrast to Frank Morris's rather ingenious escape attempt, consider the two guards that were murdered in the so-called Battle of Alcatraz in 1946, when 6 inmates attempted to escape by overthrowing the guards, and when that failed, resolved to shoot it out with them. The gun battle lasted for 3 days, ending only when the US Marines were called over from neighbouring Angel Island to storm the prison like they stormed Iwo Jima 2 years earlier. The fight left 3 prisoners dead, and 2 more would later be executed for murder in the prison's gas chambers. The last attempt came mere months before the prison was closed, when an inmate actually managed to swim all the way to shore without drowning. However, he was so exhausted once he got there that he could barely move and was swiftly recaptured on the beach. And for anyone curious about whether Alcatraz indeed managed to remain escape-proof, of the 36 people who did manage to escape, 23 were recaptured, 8 died in their attempts, and 5 are missing and presumed dead. So officially, no one ever escaped, but if you're a fan of conspiracy theories, Maybe 5 did. We'll never know. Despite strict secrecy from the government about goings on at Alcatraz, the place became pretty famous around the country almost from the moment it opened. People were fascinated by the rock, not only because of its location and structure, but because of who was kept there. A veritable rogues gallery of some of the most famous criminals in America. Al Capone, the leader of the Chicago outfit, one of the country's most violent bootlegging gangs, who was kept at Alcatraz for 5 years. Like many other inmates incarcerated there, he showed signs of insanity during his time, though his case it was likely caused by an advanced case of syphilis. Other inmates known to be housed at Alcatraz included Alvin Karpis, the only man designated public enemy number 1, who was captured alive by the FBI, Mickey Cohen, Los Angeles' answer to Al Capone, and Machine Gun Kelly, no not that one, a gangster who was named for his weapon of choice, the Thompson submachine gun. And of course, no list detailing the many people who called Alcatraz their home would be complete without mentioning Robert Stroud, aka the Birdman of Alcatraz. Now, Stroud was a convicted double murderer who found a new hobby while in prison, bird nerdery, aka ornithology. And he became something of an expert on the subject, publishing 2 books on birds and keeping hundreds of canaries in his cell at Leavenworth. But the warden found him irritating and had him sent to Alcatraz in 1942, where he spent his next 15 years. And despite his nickname, like literally being the Birdman of Alcatraz, he never actually kept any birds at Alcatraz because the warden wouldn't let him. And the 1962 film about him starring Burt Lancaster portrayed him in a considerably more sympathetic light than the real man was, because inmates and guards who knew him would describe him as dangerous, sinister, and altogether an unpleasant individual to be around. Now, most of the prisoners kept at Alcatraz, however, weren't anywhere near as famous as any of those men. At any one time, there were about 200 prisoners in the prison, supposedly the hardest cases in the country, though that tended to be overblown by the Bureau of Prisons. That was invested in keeping Alcatraz as a symbol of what would happen to other prisoners if they stepped out of line. And it's worth noting that many of the prisoners transferred to Alcatraz were not sent there because they were prolific escape artists, violent, or a threat to themselves or others, but simply because the wardens in their prisons found them annoying. For example, consider Earl Taylor, an accountant given a 5-year sentence for tax evasion. Not exactly the worst crime imaginable. He was sent to Alcatraz because the warden at his prison was irritated by his tendency to help other prisoners with their legal briefs. Think Shawshank Redemption. This didn't deter Taylor for anyone curious, and eventually he was one of the 2 inmates who successfully managed to get himself paroled directly from Alcatraz. And it wasn't just federal, but state prisons who also sent troublemakers to Alcatraz as a warning to other inmates, whether they really deserved it or not. The sentences of some of the prisoners who ended up on the rock do not exactly scream worst of the worst. And there are some pretty petty things, all things considered, that resulted in men being sent to Alcatraz, like taking cases of cigarettes from a train boxcar, a Kentucky moonshine who was convicted of not paying the tax on his distilled spirits, and one man who stole a pig from an Indian reservation. People have been protesting against Alcatraz pretty much from the moment it opened. San Franciscans, is that what they call themselves? San Franciscans? Consider it a blight on their city, stuck right out there in the bay for all to see. Many experts consider the methods employed to be altogether too harsh, making it more, not less likely to trigger violence because of the very nature of the prison itself. But what eventually did Alcatraz in was the very isolation that made it so attractive a site for a prison in the first place. Because Alcatraz was essentially just a small island out in the bay, supplies of pretty much everything from toilet paper to fresh water needs to be regularly shipped to it. And it's for this reason that Alcatraz was considered the most expensive prison to operate in America, with costs in 1959 amounting to $10 per prisoner per day. And even though initially Alcatraz had its pick of guards, like getting them to stay was kind of an issue, because you either had to find guards who were willing to commute to the island every single day, or were willing to live there with their families in the place set aside for that purpose. And think, well, surely the guards got paid more, right? You know, because they had to upend their entire lives and, raise their kids in prison. No, they earned the same as they would in any other prison, including one that was located just a few miles down the road, which didn't need to be commuted to by boat. Also, just on top of everything, the building was quite literally falling apart, the concrete eroding much faster than a normal building would due to the salt water carried on the wind. It was estimated that it would cost several $1 million in renovation work just to keep the prison operating, let alone renovate it to modern standards. And it's not like they could just hold off on doing these renovations because who really gives it's just prisoners, because the building falling apart was one of the reasons why Frank Morris was able to escape in the first place, and that didn't really do the prison's reputation any good. In 1983, it was decided to just close Alcatraz. The Bureau of Prisons would replace it with a new maximum security prison located in Marion, Illinois. The last prisoners were shipped off the island in March, and for a decade the island was really just left to rot while everyone argued about what should be done with it. Various proposals were entertained, including a West Coast version of the Statue of Liberty, a casino, a monument to the United Nations, and or world peace for some reason. And in 1969, a group of American Indians occupied the island, claiming that under the terms of the Fort Laramie Treaty, they had a right to, and I quote, surplus government land. The occupation of Alcatraz lasted all the way until 1971, when they were finally forced off, though the group did successfully manage to raise awareness about Indian issues with the American public, making it one of the first major events of the so-called Red Power movement. In 1972, Richard Nixon signed a law to create the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, a unit administered by the National Park Service that included Alcatraz as well as the Presidio and Muir Woods, along with other historic and scenic areas around San Francisco. The infamous prison thus became a tourist trap, in the most literal sense of the word. And it's quite a popular one at that too, because an estimated 1.5 million people take the ferry to the island each and every year. And admittedly, yes, the prison has undergone some renovation work since then, but that's mostly to make it safe for those tourists to walk around, so they don't trip over and have the government owe them their college tuition. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the fact that the prison has been quite a popular site for making movies, including two in particular that are primarily set on the island prison. The 1979's Escape from Alcatraz, which dramatizes the story of the famous 1962 escape with Clint Eastwood portraying Frank Morris, and 1996's The Rock, in which a group... I don't need to read the script for this one. The Rock is Nicolas Cage's best work. The Rock is a film in which Sean Connery escapes from Alcatraz and then has to break back in. He's the one guy who's ever escaped, and they make him break back in. And they have a chase where Nick Cage drives a yellow Lamborghini, and for anyone who doesn't know about The Rock, there is a very popular fan theory, which I don't personally ascribe to, but it does make the movie really fun on a rewatch. And that theory is that Sean Connery's character in The Rock is actually James Bond. And it's James Bond after he was disavowed after one of his missions. And if you watch the movie with that in mind, it's really, really fun, because it's just, it's an older James Bond and showing that he's still got it. So again, I don't personally ascribe to that theory, but it does make the film fun on a rewatch. Not to mention, just Nick Caging it all the way up. But yes, I hope everyone enjoyed that video. Apologies to the editor for this one. This is my first video of the day, and I've only had a single cup of coffee so far. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you have any comments, in particular about my presentation and hosting style, which I'm hoping to refine over the next couple of weeks in my stint as interim host for this channel. You'll notice I'm wearing a nice jacket now, because I feel Biographics and Geographics, they have an altogether more professional tone than the sister channel top 10s, so I thought, you know what, I might try and class it up a little bit by putting on this £40 polyester jacket. But I do appreciate everyone sticking with me during this interim phase, and I know that behind the scenes everyone is working hard to make the best videos we can. If you have any suggestions for another region of the world that you think we should cover in a video, let us know and we'll get a handsome member of our writing team right on that one. But otherwise, as I always like to say, I hope everyone at home has the day they deserve. Cheers!